Welcome. My name is William Messenkar. I am a master model railroader in the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the National Model Railroad Association. I want to welcome all of you to the virtual layout tour we'll have presented today by members of the NMRA. We would encourage you to find out about the NMRA and join in order to participate in these virtual tours. We have other virtual clinics and other activities for the National Model Railroad Association that we think you'll find a big help to your modeling, and you'll get to meet model railroaders just like you. So welcome to our tour, and I hope you enjoy it.
You may not know Bob, Richard. He's been way too busy for his career to socialize with us at a lot of our meetings, but he's an ardent NP fan, lives in Wallingford, and is building a really beautiful layout.
Well, thanks, Burr. Thanks, everybody, for signing on a Saturday to see this. I thought I'd start off by just talking a little bit about how I came to be I always refer to myself as a beginner model railroader, but I think after today presenting to this group, I think I no longer can say that. I think I'm actually a true model railroader. And then I'll talk a little bit about why I picked Easton and picked sort of this 1940s. Then I'll give you a brief tour of the layout. I'll do it with some pictures here, but I'll go downstairs to the layout and we'll see how that goes. To get to where I am today, as a kid, I always liked model railroads, but never really had a chance to work on them. I've got my dad's tin plate sitting here from, I used to go over to my grandmother's house, and it never ran until I actually got a hold of it a few years ago and sort of rewired it. Now it's running again. But as a kid, I just shoved it around on carpets. I think my dad for Christmas paid somebody to put together a HO figure 8. I think it was a River Rossi steam engine. And I think it ran for a total of about 2 months before we burned out that engine. I do remember the fact that they had to get it down in the basement and no one had thought about that. So they cut the whole thing in half. It had this big kind of jagged cut right through it. And then they sort of stuck it in the basement. And then as around 13 or 14, I think I got a hold of a book and really wanted to build one, and built an N scale 2x4 layout that, again, the engine didn't hold up very well. And then I headed off, college and kids and that sort of thing. And it's actually the kids that really have got me back into model railroading. I think that's something that we don't always realize. I wouldn't underestimate the role Thomas plays in getting people into model railroading or the future of model railroading, because my kids were just nuts about Thomas. As someone who hadn't done very much and really didn't have all the skills to do model railroading, just starting off by building a tiny little train table that the kids liked and painting it and watching them play and playing with them really sort of got me started thinking about trains again and reminding me of how much I really enjoyed model railroads. And then my sister must have understood it better than I did about my interest in model railroads, because this is now we're like, I think 2010, 2011. She sent us a sort of a starter set Christmas tree. And once we finished with Christmas, I was along the lines of, well, I can't just put this in a box and leave it alone. The kids want to play with it. I sort of started looking at YouTubes and figuring out how to build a layout, for the kids. And this is kind of where it was at this point, learning lots of different lessons about don't build S curves, the problems with Bachmann track, all these sort of things came up when I built this one. That's sort of the first part to it. And the second part you already saw. Picked up kits I learned about eBay, which is dangerous. But then it was the narrow gauge convention that was held in Seattle in 2011. And since I was sort of playing with trains by that time, I signed up to go to the various layout tours and was surprised to see that Paul Scholes lived not too far from me. That layout sort of changed my whole view of model railroading and what it meant to be a model railroader. And I think I walked out of that layout room saying, I think I've got to change my approach. I spoke to him briefly at that time, and I had sort of the inkling of the idea to get into the NP at that point, but that's mainly because I live so close to the Burke-Gilman Trail, and reading on the history of the Burke-Gilman Trail and seeing that NP trains ran on that straight up into the late 50s, 60s. Not far from Gasworks Park, reading about Gasworks Park and starting to think, well, that would be sort of fun to model. I actually spoke to Paul Scholes that night about, maybe doing the old Woodinville line out through, and model Gasworks Park, and sort of got interested in NP and started reading about NP. But the first thing I did is we had moved into this house in 2008, and I was really lucky that we had a great basement family room, which is shown here. It had lots of storage room. And we had these two rooms, which they're marked here as crawl space, but you can stand in them. They're unfinished areas here and here. This was where the kids' layout was. I sort of said, well, there's no way anybody could complain if I head into the crawl space and build a layout there. And so these two pictures sort of show my first layout and sort of the conditions that I built it in. That's my son, Seamus, who run lots of trains on. And since, we don't live very far from the Bascule Bridge down by the locks, we had to have a Bascule Bridge. Around that time, North End Trains was closing. And as he was selling things off, things got cheaper and cheaper. So I got an NCE system at that point in time. Also bought my first DCC engines and realized I really like the idea of running long trains. And I think I'm partially a victim of Walthers and the fact that they try to sell all these name trains, passenger name trains. But this layout was designed to have an around the room so we could run sort of longer trains. And we sort of worked on a harbor scene and that sort of thing. But I think anybody who, any of you guys immediately realized there's no floor, there is no ceiling, there are ducts. It was a pretty unpleasant place to build a model railroad, but it was a great learning layout. Other things I learned is number 4 Atlas code 100 turnouts in a yard don't work very well. And I also learned to really hate derailments and wanted to try to work on track work and see if I could improve that. So that meant I had to move into the family room. And right around this time, the kids were losing interest in that railroad. And so I thought, well, I think I could build a shelf layout along the wall here without taking away too much of the family space, without too much complaint. That was my first plan of trying to build a layout of higher quality. I thought I would have a yard here and maybe have a switching layout, though I still had sort of this interest in doing mainline railroading and couldn't quite figure out how I was going to make that work. The construction of this, I sort of built these sort of cabinets with drawers, and on top of it are these 8-foot modules. You can see how they connect here, and they're just bolted together. Sort of realized that I think with any railroad, it doesn't last forever. And at some point you might need to make changes, move it, put it somewhere else. So I have 3 of these cabinets. You can't see the one here with an 8-foot piece, another 8-foot piece. And then the yard is built on one piece of plywood. And then these are just sort of shelves here. Around this time, I got a hold of Jim Frederickson's books, his photography books about the Northern Pacific. He's got three volumes of them. And this picture really jumped out to me. I knew I liked the Northern Pacific. I'd been reading about the Northern Pacific. I thought this looked like that this is a yard that could be modeled. A relatively small yard, could fit in the space that I have, had a lot of modeling potential. I'm drawn to the transition era, this whole idea of how you would go from a steam engine to a diesel engine. And then at the same time, I really like hiking. I like to get up into the mountains. Easton is not that far away. Stampede Pass would be fun to explore, get up and do some hiking. It's got a great station, water tower, a lot of things. And as I joined the OPSIG at that time and LDSIG, and as you're building these things, you're wondering about what sort of an operating railroad you could have. I've never quite been drawn to switching, but I really like locomotives, like engines. And so having sort of a locomotive servicing terminal where you could have engines come in, they could be refueled, watered, dump out their cinders, and then get back loaded onto a train that's just come out through the pass and then head off. I thought that could work within a shelf layout to move around some engines. It also gave me an option of sort of working on fixing up engines. And there's a lot of great NP steam available, mostly in brass. So at the same time I'm building this shelf layout, I realized this very empty space in here that if I put a hole through the wall, I could do a turnback loop. So if I brought a train in, swapped out the power to head down the hill, down into the east side, I could then build a turnback loop here. And so what I ended up sort of proposing and planning was I initially built this one, a 36-inch radius, since I was talking about doing sort of mainline trains, including steam here in the unfinished area, and initially sort of proposed doing this, but it took away a little bit too much real estate, doing another 36-inch radius turnback loop that I could then scenic. So this took a little while before I built up the nerve to actually do that. So here's the layout when I first initially built it. This is now 2012, 2013. This is when I started to sort of scenic it and try to turn it into a actual engine terminal. You can see the necessary beverage when you're working on your layout. At this time, I also wanted to I hadn't done really very much scenicking at this time, or working on scenic. And this area of the layout, I decided to put in a siding for sort of a maintenance of way, or and see if I could scenic it and see if I could get to the level of quality that I'd first seen on Paul Scholes. So here you can see here how it ends sort of abruptly right here, this main line. And this was sort of my first attempt at building scenery. My kids like the train layout, sort of. She is pretending. She never really showed much that interest, but my son actually kind of got into it and would come down, and if he wasn't breaking a tree, he would actually be helping me. Occasionally, though, I would come down and there were 20 diesel locomotives on every part of the layout, and he's very good at putting things onto the layout, but not putting away trains and locomotives. Around this time, a lot of people were using Helicon Focus, and I just tried to see if I could get to a level where, with photography, to make it so that the scenery was of good quality, good level. This is the only steam engine that I've taken from brass and painted and remotored, and that's down on the layout now as we speak. It's actually a T1 Prairie, which would never run in this part of the NP, but they're relatively inexpensive Pacific fast mail engines. So that, for learning how to fix up a brass engine, I think it was a good choice. This tree is made using a wire method. I think around this time I was listening to a lot of podcasts, and in particular, they mentioned this one modeler out of Britain called Gordon Gravitt. And these books are just fantastic. And they're not easy to get. I just looked on Amazon for they're running about $50 to $60 each. I think when I ordered them, I got them straight from the publisher in Britain, and they run around $40, depending on how the pound's doing. So this is sort of the first thing I did then was, after when I realized I could sort of expand, I took a very narrow slice and sort of started to move in from the railroad standpoint. This is in the easterly direction, away from the hole in the wall, and started doing more of this scenery, adding in bushes and things. And then finally, I had this bridge from the prior layout, and I knew I wanted to include it. The issue with these bridges always is there's no such thing as just a two-tower bridge. I mean, whenever I say that, somebody finds a picture of one. But since I have very limited space, I tried to sort of squeeze it in, and it's a nice element, partly because it really drops way down. So when kids come in, they're essentially at the level of this fisherman down here. It's a great location for kids to watch trains. And then finally, I took a plunge and went ahead and put in that turnback loop, and so far so good. I haven't been told I have to take it out yet. I did build it with it's sort of modular in its own right. It wouldn't be that hard to take it out and actually move it if and when I decide that it's not the right place. It's 36 inches, though. I think I should go back and check this area here. This is a point where I think it's actually drops down a little less. Whether to put in a different turnout here and try to smooth that out. As I mentioned, one of the reasons I really like this is you get to read about NP steam. And even though these northerns were not common in Easton, they would certainly be used, get passenger trains. And so this is three, I think it's an A1, A3, and A5 northern steam engine. This one is the latest BLI hybrid that I just got last year, which runs beautifully, and it's just a great engine. Whereas this is a Sunset models, which I will never take it around a turn. It's just not a great runner. And then this is a Pacific Fast Mail that runs reasonably well. The problem with brass engines is it turns into a little bit of an addiction in its own right. And so I'm constantly prowling eBay, driving up the prices. But the ones that would run through, a key one is here, this Z3, which would have been a key engine for coming from through the tunnel, and were used way beyond when they should have been used. And I never stopped my kids from putting on Milwaukee Road or SP or any other engines they want to run. The only scratch built thing I've done so far is this coal tower, which is based on a famous model railroader plans from, I guess, in the 50s that seem to fit very well based on the pictures. And I'll show you some more pictures of Easton. But that's a part of the hobby I'd love to have more time to do and start getting more involved in. In getting ready for this talk, I've been putting decoders in lots of steam engines and getting things ready. And this is to tell you that even though I do it, I would never do it for anyone else, because as you can tell, I could be a little neater. So this is that Z3 engine, not the greatest picture, at Easton in front of the coal tower. And I think this engine is just one of the reasons I want to do Easton. And I have a couple of these from Pacific Fast Mail that I'm going to paint and put decoders in. They were built in, they're Malleys, built in the 1910 to 1920, and they wanted to retire them in the 30s, but because they really didn't have any other engines that could get through the tunnel, the Zs were too big, the Z6 and Z8s were too big, that they kept them, and they ran them all the way through the 40s, and they're just neat engines. They also had these W3s. I have a W3 to use as a help. They used them as helper engines through Stampede Pass. And these are pictures I've taken off the Northern Pacific Historical Society, where they're unfortunately kind of small thumbnails. There's a better picture of the one of the Malleys. And then of course they had really challengers to head from Easton to get down into the Tri-Cities and beyond. When you're building a shelf layout, it's probably not a good idea to think you're going to run these engines, but I think this modeling that I'm doing gives me a chance to have these on the layout and even run some relatively long engines. Now there's that T1, the only the brass engine that I've done, the Prairie, which would have run primarily in the east of Montana. The other thing, looking recently on the NP Historical Society Association website, is Easton had this covered turntable that, from what I can tell, they would use to turn the Z3s. The Z6s and Z8s, they ended up building a Y that I am not modeling. If I did, it would go off through the wall out into the neighbor's yard. But I do have that turnaround loop that I can sort of use in place of the Z8 for modeling that. But this is something that when I first thought about this, I thought it would be really fun to scratch build this covered turntable. And the reason they had to have it covered is shown here. You can see the snow piled up in Easton, how they're still able to get access, even though it looks to me like there's tons of snow that's been blown under. So here's the info slide. So I've got about 35 feet of mainline, mainly code 83 microengineering and some code 70 with some sidings and some hand laid in some areas. It's NC DCC. I power the frogs with these frog juicers from Tam Valley. A few years back, they were having a sale, and I bought like 15 of them for like $8 each or something like that. I have these DCC specialties auto reversers on the loops, so that I can operate this and not worry about throwing those turnouts. Getting actually just a few months ago, I didn't realize I'd bought a switch it, and I put that on the 2 main line, and they're number 8 turnouts on my main line. And then I have number 6 turnouts in the yard that are controlled by these bullfrogs, which are from Fast Tracks. And almost all my turnouts are Fast Tracks turnouts. I put in the capacitors, the stay alives on my DCC decoders. And I sort of think of this as a belt and suspenders between the frog juicers and the capacitors. I hope I never have an engine stall out, but it can happen. So happy to go down to the layout. I'm not sure how we doing on time, Burr. Are we, let me check the.
Yeah, you're good. Let's
Yeah,
go
good.
down and see the
All right.
layout.
Yep.
Run a train, and then we'll take your questions.
So I think I've shown you guys a lot of the scenic areas, the pictures of the scenic areas. Not much has, I think, changed. I've got these FT engines, which are these Bowser engines coming through the, let's see, oh, of course, when you're doing this, you're going to get a derailment. So that's the first thing that happened. The town itself is not really based on Easton, the structures, at least not yet. When I built this, my son brought all the structures out and put them all wherever he wanted. And I've kind of said, sure, go for it. And some of the other things is this is 3D printed. It's actually not that bad. And it's the person who puts it up on Thingiverse is somewhere around here in Seattle. And I assume he's a model railroader. Oh. And then what to model over here on this blob is sort of an open question, whether it's going to be just a farmland or I was thinking apple orchards potentially. We'll see. But whether that blob stays there, and if at some point I get permission to take down the jungle gym, I think I could extend over the door and move into that area. And I'll show you guys sort of this unfinished area because that's sort of a temptation. How much to extend into there. This is sort of the turn back loop, and there's quite a bit of space back here. So I think I could do staging potentially, just have a covered staging yard to try to limit the amount of grime and dirt that gets on the engines, and have trains sort of that can come out and I'll go ahead and head back upstairs and we'll sort of just continue.
Does anyone have any questions for Bob? I think that's the end of the layout tour.
I was gonna say, nice layout. Does anyone know what was Gasworks Park originally used for? I mean, I know it's called Gasworks Park.
Sure.
Stored gas there.
Yeah. I mean, it was a gasification plant, and it was a big selling point, I think, for industries in Seattle that they built this around 1900. Initially, they would take coal, I'm assuming from Newcastle, and gasify the coal, and then that switched over to using oil. So they had a lot of train traffic. NP would drop off lots of coal, and you can even see the trestle still in Gasworks Park where they would, track went across the trestle to dump off coal.
Thank you very much.
Bob, this is Bill Messenkar. I built that coaling tower. It brought back a lot of memories to me because it was located across the river in Bellows Falls, Vermont. And it's an October, November, December 1952 model, three-part model railroad article. That was one of the first structures I scratch built. I love that pulling tower in that article. You did a great job on it, it looks like.
It's about 3/4 done. I've stopped. I haven't put on any stairs or ladders yet. And part of it is it gets knocked over. I haven't affixed it yet. It's sort of on the very front of the layout.
Yeah.
And the kids are constantly banging into it. So I've sort of held off and trying to finish it. But yeah, and I chased down those model railroaders at down at Scott's and and got the original copies and found them and used it.
Good for you.
I just had one quick thing, Bob. Nice to see your layout. I'm a big fan of those Gordon Gravitt books. You know, I have pretty much all of them, and there's a whole bunch more of them too. That they publish from Miles Swan. I have a whole bunch of other ones. If anyone's interested, I know the publisher is now in my hometown in Bath, England, and I visit there occasionally and buy a bunch of books. They have a little bookshop. It's called a Titfield Thunderbolt. But if anyone's interested, I can put you in touch with how to get hold of those. He's shipped me stuff direct before at a very reasonable price, so you can find them on Amazon. But they're great books on a whole bunch of aspects of modeling.
Yeah, they make you look at scenery a little differently. I mean, you know, Dave Frary, wonderful. Paul Scholes, wonderful. But he's got this. Obviously, it's for relatively small show layouts. I can't imagine doing a huge. I'm looking at Burr's layout at that level throughout the thing. But for certain scenes, and just makes you look at things differently. Great book.
Yeah, no, it makes you do the whole thing to the same standard, which is embarrassing. I'm glad to hear there's another railroad near me. I'm up in Queen Anne, so it's nice to know that you're down in Wallingford, Burr's up the road. So it's kind of nice to have one local.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I have a question. Do you have any thoughts about lighting, improving the lighting?
Yeah, I mean, it could absolutely be improved. I've got those old canister lights there. I could certainly increase, what's there, but I think there's got to be some really easy things to do that could improve it. But I really haven't at this point.
Yeah. Actually, the other thing I've noticed about lighting is if you just wait 5 years, it's a whole new industry.
Yeah. No, I mean, LEDs. And at one point I bought some bulbs that are really good for photography, to try to brighten things up, and I can screw them in if I ever wanted to do photography. But for, just standard me running the layout, I've never really been that concerned about getting it lighted to the level you need to show it in, let's say, an NMRA 4D a presentation. But yeah.
Well, the other approach you could think about, Bob, is you've got a nice long linear layout. It'd be perfect for the right kind of fluorescent tubes that are also very friendly for photography and simulate natural lighting. I use those on mine, and you only need about 4 of them, and you could light the whole thing with no shadows.
Yeah.
So that might be a different approach you might think about.
Yeah.
We have a panel scheduled on lighting. Mike May in Durango, Colorado, and Jerry Cornwell, who's a lighting expert in Toronto, Canada, is on August 10 on our narrow gauge monthly showings. And that information will be published in the Grab Iron shortly.
Any other questions for Bob? Yeah.
This is Lee Marsh. I was going to make a comment about the lighting. As I recently replaced a bunch of fluorescents on my layout with LEDs that I got from Home Depot, and they don't draw much current. They light the layout wonderfully, and it works well for photos. So.
Yeah. I think I could just pop in LEDs with much higher lumens, and I think it would make a big difference probably. They're not lined up exactly where they were. Pretty easy to drop in a few more if I wanted to, I guess.
Any other questions for Bob?
Well, thanks, Bob.
Yeah, no, thanks for any, and if you think of anything, feel free to email me. I'm in the group, and of course, people get your vaccine so you can come visit at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you have your vaccine, you can come now, probably. Yeah. So, all right. Thank you.
Hello again. This is another reminder that this virtual layout tour has been brought to you by members of the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the National Model Railroad Association. And we hope you've enjoyed it. And we want to encourage you to, again, find out about the NMRA online. Both PNR and NMRA have an excellent website where you can get information about joining and participating in this and other activities like our clinics that are held all over the region. So thank you for joining us today and wish you great modeling.